Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through the current status of my Sunday sermon. If you have a comment, leave it, and I usually try to see them Saturday and Sunday morning before I preach, and hopefully your comments will make my sermon better. Well, after 3 years, the Christian Reformed Church this June is going to once again have its used to be annual synod, used to be before COVID. We've had 2 postponements during COVID. And there are a number of big issues on the agenda for this synod. The human sexuality report is the one that's getting a lot of the attention, with some changes and developments in Classis Grand Rapids East. It may be that events at this synod will significantly change the future, or perhaps will end the CRC as we know it. But that ending has been coming in other ways. Christian Reformed Church reached its peak membership in the early 1990s and has been in a pretty significant decline ever since as a denomination. Now, the Christian Reformed Church is part of a much larger church ecosystem in America. Churches have been splitting over the questions about same-sex marriage and same-sex sexuality and a variety of issues. In fact, just in 2020, 2021, and 2022, there have been a number of new denominations that have formed. The Alliance of Reformed Churches is forming, and the Kingdom Network are both splitting out of the Reformed Church in America, and even the Reformed Protestant Church is a split-off of the Protestant Reformed Churches, which split off the Christian Reformed Church in the early part of the 20th century. And so in many ways, some of the challenges that churches within the Christian Reformed Church are facing are obviously out there in the far larger culture. And that's often the way it is. Cultures are sort of nested inside of one another. Week after week, as we've been going through the Gospels, we've been talking about the Judean culture war and all of the sort of struggles that Judah and the Galilee and the Jews were dealing with as being this tiny little nation within the Roman Empire. And this is sort of a microcosm of a far larger, broader conflict. We often see these conflicts through interpretive lenses, and one of the key interpretive lenses of the first century was Daniel 7. And this was sort of the framework through which many members of the community were understanding what was going on in the larger world. Now, the book of Daniel really is in 2 separate sections. Daniel chapter 1 through 6 is a whole series of trials and ordeals where Daniel and his 3 friends are always come out on top against the great empire of Babylon and its emperor Nebuchadnezzar. In chapter 1, there's a food ordeal. In chapter 2, Daniel recounts and interprets the dream of Nebuchadnezzar and is exalted. In chapter 3, you have worshiping the image and the fiery furnace ordeal, where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come out unscathed. Daniel chapter 4, you have the story of Nebuchadnezzar's pride and his humiliation, his madness, and then his restoration, where he acknowledges God. Daniel chapter 5, you have the famous story of the handwriting on the wall. And Babylon, this world city, and it very much is a world city. There's a podcast by The Rest is History about Babylon. It was the, at least for the area of the world around Mesopotamia, Egypt, it was the world city. It was the largest city in the world. And that's partly reflected in the book of Revelation, where you always hear talk about Babylon, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Daniel 6, Daniel and the lion's den. It's an ordeal by lion. We had ordeal by fire, ordeal by food. And then in Daniel chapter 7, the entire mood of the book changes. Daniel, who was always large and in charge and on top through chapters 1 through 6, now suddenly is dreaming. And he's talking about these dreams, and he's bothered by these dreams, and these wild images come to him in these dreams. After that, in my vision In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was a fourth beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the other former beasts. It had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow. The hair on his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. Now, these great beasts that come up out of the sea are the empires of the world that crush and destroy. And, of course, the Ancient of Days is the God of Israel, and he's setting up seats, and he's about to judge these empires. Egypt, Babylon, Rome. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were open. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain, and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, and they were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Now again, as we've been going through the Gospel of John, we've been seeing that this title, Jesus takes this Son of Man reference in the book of Daniel and uses it as a title to refer to himself. Now, of course, Romans wouldn't pick up on this very well, but Jews who knew very well the book of Daniel, and the book of Daniel was very popular at this time in Israel, would clearly understand who Jesus was identifying himself to be. Now, what will happen? The kingdoms of this world, the beasts that come out of the sea, Egypt, Babylon, Rome. Last week we looked at Moscow, thinking about it being the new Rome, and America leading the other nations of the world against her. That's very much sort of the mentality that Alexander Dugin understands the current war that we see between Ukraine and Russia. But where is Jerusalem in this narrative? Well, if you read other prophets, Jerusalem is to be exalted. Jerusalem is to be the center of the world. Jerusalem is to be the new Rome. And in fact, when we get to Acts chapter 1, after the crucifixion and resurrection, the disciples, the question on their mouth is, now will you restore the kingdom to Israel? Now, Jesus, will you finally place Jerusalem on top of the world and make it the center of the world? Bring it to where it should be? Jesus doesn't exactly say no, which is very interesting. He says, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you. And of course, the book of Acts will continue from there. But where we're at in the story of John is now finally Jesus will be talking to the governor, the individual, the representative of Rome sent to keep order and keep Roman power over God's holy land and God's holy people. Maybe now Judas will get his moment. Then the religious leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the place because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" Now, we don't learn a lot about Pilate in the four Gospels, but we can piece some pictures together about Pilate from other contemporary accounts of him. Here's one. Pilate's cruel behavior and disregard for Jewish customs began immediately upon his arrival in Palestine in AD 26. This is probably about 4 years before this incident. It's probably around 30 AD that Jesus' trial is going on. He obtained his position through his mentor Sejanus, who was the commander of the Praetorian Guard and known to hate the Jews. The Praetorian Guard were basically the bodyguard of Caesar, and as in many ways the empire began to take up power during Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, through this Julian Claudian family, the Praetorian Guard eventually got more and more powerful and began to be the power brokers. So Pilate had an inside track to the very center of power in Rome. Pilate first offended the Jews by bringing Roman standards with images of the emperor into Jerusalem. Previous prefects had not placed any images in Jerusalem. They understood the Jewish sensitivities. The Jewish people sent a delegate to Caesarea and pleaded with Pilate for 5 days to remove the images from the city. On the 6th day, Pilate sent soldiers into the crowd. At his signal, they were to draw their swords and cut the Jews to pieces if they did not allow Caesar's image. The Jews fell down together and exposed their necks, for they would rather die than transgress their law. This is a pretty significant statement. Pilate, not desiring a revolution, decided to remove the images from Jerusalem. This is from Josephus. A second conflict occurred after Pilate took funds from the sacred treasury to build aqueducts. When Pilate visited Jerusalem, his actions caused an uproar among the Jews. He mixed his own soldiers into the crowd disguised as citizens. At his signal, they beat the protesters with clubs. Many Jews died from the beating or were trampled by the crowd. Another story from Josephus. You get a sense of, well, this is sort of the way the world worked, and in fact, in many places in the world, continues to work today. Philo describes an incident where Pilate, in an attempt to honor the Emperor Tiberius, placed shields bearing the emperor's name in the former palace of Herod in Jerusalem. By placing the shields in the headquarters of the Roman administration, not the temple, Herod was attempting to not offend the Jews. However, the leading Jews, along with 4 of Herod's sons, requested that Pilate remove the shields. When he refused, they appealed to Emperor Tiberius by letter. Tiberius was infuriated and ordered Pilate to remove the shields and place them at the temple of Augustus at Caesarea. Pilate's attempt to honor Tiberius caused him to fall into disfavor. The last recorded conflict resulted in Pilate's removal from office. When a Samaritan false prophet led his followers to Mount Gerizim, claiming to show them Moses' sacred relics, Pilate blocked their route, and with cavalry and armed men. Some followers were able to flee, but others were killed or taken prisoner. The most prominent men were executed. The Samaritans appealed to Vitellius, the prefect of Syria. Vitellius sent Marcellus to temporarily take over Judea and to order Pilate to stand before the emperor in Rome to answer the accusations of the Jews. This took place at the end of AD 36, or at the beginning of AD 37, so 6 or 7 years after Jesus' trial. And he arrived in Rome after Tiberius' death. Tiberius died in March of 37. Before Pilate arrived, nothing is recorded of Pilate after his arrival in Rome, but he was likely exiled to France. Eusebius recorded that Pilate committed suicide after the trial of Jesus, though no evidence confirms this. So that gives you a little bit of background into this man, Pilate. Obviously someone who knew brutality, very much wanted to keep a lid on things, and was looking to do the will of Rome. In some cases, more brutal on the Jews than even Tiberius would have him be. The picture in the New Testament is an interesting one, which I think I'm going to talk about in my Sunday school class on Sunday too, where, well, how should Christians think about Roman morality? And that's actually a very complex question. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Now, if you've ever served jury duty, this is precisely the thing that the judge will warn you about. The trial is an attempt to find fact and assess guilt or innocence. And someone shouldn't be found guilty just because they're brought to the trial. This is part of course, American criminal justice. Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him in your own law." But we have no right to execute anyone, they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, this is a really critical question, because what does Rome and what do Pilate really care about? They basically want the Jews to keep to their business, pay their taxes, don't cause trouble, get along. They're not looking, the Romans are very good at putting down sedition. And Jesus is being brought to him on charges of sedition because that would result in crucifixion. The Roman emperor was the one who made kings. He was the king of kings in his realm. And anyone who claimed to be king was not named by the emperor to be king was in fact an enemy of the emperor. So what's the truth about Jesus? In a sense, Jesus is sort of in a box. If he claims to be a king, he could be in trouble. If he denies being a king, well, what does that say about what Jesus has said about himself as Son of Man? Who really rules this world is in many ways what's beneath it all. Now again, remember the temptations of Jesus in the wilderness. "Is this your own idea?" Jesus asked. "Or did others talk to you about me?" It's a very cagey question. "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it that you've done?" Now, Pilate understands that he's a middleman, and he knows very well that people will go up over his head if he doesn't treat people well, but he doesn't want to lose the amount of power that he has. So he's playing this middle game. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." Now, that's a very complex answer, and you can see how Jesus is reframing who he is and how he stands with respect to, well, God's people and God's place. "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." Pilate has a bit of understanding about this because, of course, he's at a lower level. He's not from the world of the Jews either. Worlds are sort of nested realities. And really, in many ways, Judas and Peter got this wrong. But can he make the jump to imagine a world above the world of Rome? "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. Pilate lives in a world where there is only power. Everything is power. It is all merely political. Might makes right. To sort of re-paraphrase something that Hitler once said of the Pope, how many legions would you need to handle truth? Now ponder that question. How many legions would you need to handle truth? Standing before him is someone that this world of the sword has no purchase upon. And we'll see that soon. With this he went out again to the Jews and gathered them and said, "I find no basis of charge against him." He understands what a rebel looks like when he sees one. "But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. The Jerusalem leaders demonstrate what sort of activities they support, and their little game with Pilate continues. Jesus did not participate. in the way Pilate understood. Pilate understands, well, this is how we deal with politics and power, the power of the sword. So Jesus made no sense to him. But Pilate wasn't so committed to this to not crucify Jesus, you'll notice. We saw what kind of man Pilate is. Jesus is the light of the world, and his light is shining on Pilate, and Pilate needs to make a decision. This theme of darkness and light has been working its way through the entire Gospel of John, John chapter 1. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believe in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God. John chapter 3. This is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but people love darkness instead of light, because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does evil hates the light, and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. But whoever lives by the truth comes into the light, so that it may be seen plainly that they have done has been done in the sight of God. And here is Pilate. Notice that this happens, according to John's chronology, just at daybreak. Job cries out in his misery, if only God would come down, if only I could get a hold of him and fix him and get a handle on him, then we'll have light. Judas fantasizes about nailing Jesus down, but it doesn't work like he fantasized. The Jerusalem leaders decide they will put Jesus on trial, but they didn't get what they want, and now Pilate, and he doesn't know what to do. How Jesus addresses us turns on the light, and when we look at ourselves, we don't always like what we see. We demand the light be extinguished so that we can live in darkness. Pilate thinks he can stay above it all. He can play cagey games and let someone go and do all of this. Jesus won't let him out. Jesus won't let him go. Jesus won't let him ride the fence. Pilate has to default to the sort of nihilism. What is truth? How many legions are required to handle truth? Jesus will win. Jesus is the Son of Man. Rome will fall to Jesus. But none of it will happen in the way Pilate or Caesar or the Jerusalem leaders could imagine. Jesus is shining light onto us, and we don't always like what we see. Before the light of Jesus, Rome looks impotent, yet Jesus will hang on a Roman cross. These are all the conflicts that come into this story. This is the shape of the Christian life. This is where we live it. In this light, in this darkness, with this world, with this conflict, how many legions are required to handle truth?